You're probably thinking, I definitely don't need another podcast in my life.
I keep coming back to this idea of being seen and known. Like in churches, we want to be seen and known.
The sort of scrappy, resourceful nature of the small church is a fascinating topic to me, and obviously a motivating one too. It's obviously something we care a lot about.
So many times it's disarming because they're like, oh, you like actually are choosing to spend some time with me. Yeah, we want to.
Welcome to Parish, a video podcast that celebrates, equips, and focuses on small churches and why they matter so much. We believe that small churches are uniquely positioned to integrate in their communities and engage issues in ways only small churches can. I'm your host, Canaan Hurst, and this is episode 1. You've never heard of us. Welcome to Parish.
Here we are.
Thank you.
You're welcome. This is our first one, and I think our kind of tagline for this is celebrating, equipping, and focusing on small churches and why they matter in the world so much. Does that sound good?
Works for me.
Great.
Those are all things I agree with, so that works out really well.
Today we've got Nathan Hoag and Maggie Burns.
Hi.
Both are pastors at the Sacred Grace Englewood, which is a small church in Englewood, Colorado, hoping to be a mega church.
False.
And
No.
Cut that out immediately.
yeah.
Can you bleep that out like it was a curse?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I'm Canaan Hurst, and I'm a filmmaker in Englewood. You have no idea who we are if you're listening and are not our small amount of friends or family.
Mm-hmm.
And we actually think that's a good thing because we feel like there's a huge lack of resources for small church leaders and members and pastors in the world. And we're going to get into that in just a minute. First, I want to do some introductions. So say who you are, what you do at the church, and kind of your journey. Both of you have been a part of bigger expressions of church and smaller expressions of church. Talk about how you got here and why you care about small churches so much.
Nathan, you can start.
You want me to go first?
Yeah, go
Are
first.
you sure? Okay, here we go. I'm Nathan Hoag. I'm the parish pastor of the Sacred Grace Englewood. I planted the church in 2016 is when we launched. Canaan was right there alongside me. We were kind of setting off on a new idea, a new concept, at least new to us, to plant a church that had a specific focus on a particular geography. And we really fell in love with the city of Englewood, where we are right now, and just everything that sort of makes Englewood what it is, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And so we decided to launch that church in 2016, and it has been a wild ride of a lot of ups and downs and a lot of challenges. And I feel like this year especially is probably the year where we've hit probably the most significant stride we've ever been in. We feel really content kind of with where we are, and we're really grateful for that. But I come from sort of a long line of large church experiences. When I lived in Atlanta, I went to large churches. Even when I went to college in Valdosta, Georgia, I went to like large churches by Valdosta standards, which wasn't saying much, but just like the largest churches in town are the ones that I always ended up being a part of. So yeah, when I finished seminary, I ended up working for a large church, and loved it for the experience. It was like a great place to cut my teeth, such a great place to learn the ins and outs of church ministry. I learned what I'm good at. I learned what I'm not good at. I learned what I needed to work on. But it just wasn't a sustainable thing for me, you know? So it was just like, one day I kind of woke up and was like, this is just not like a long-term career for me. I really want to be part of a neighborhood small church, and started poking around till I eventually found some folks who would help me plant a church that was like that. So, yeah, I mean, our family's sort of made up of a hodgepodge of different people through the foster care and adoption, and we kind of have a revolving door of kids coming in and out of our house, into running, into whiskey, into coffee, into podcasts. Not really. This is my first real podcast.
So you kind of sought out small church expression.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. But you weren't like a lead pastor of a mega church.
No. I was like a assistant pastor, young adults pastor. I mean, I did like 10 different things at that church. And like I said, loved it, but just, I want to be a pastor for the rest of my life. I want to do it for decades. And that environment was going to burn me out, really fast. And the size and the pace of the church had a lot to do with the rate at which I was burning out. And I was in my 20s, and it was really weird to wake up, 25, 26, something like that, and be like, I'm burning out in my career and I'm just beginning it. And that was just not a sustainable model for me.
Yeah. Maggie, what about you? What's kind of your story in the church and history and getting to a small church?
Church and history.
And
I was born in 1980. No, I'm kidding.
Start earlier. Start with
my parents met.
There you go.
In the great state of Wisconsin.
Now, what about their parents? Though?
Yeah, right.
These are all excellent questions. No, I'm from a family that doesn't know their genealogy very well, so I wouldn't get very far. I feel like Nathan and my church histories are rather similar, honestly. I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago, the area right around Wheaton, where there are so many churches. Every block of the town has a different type of church on it. And so my parents were pretty new believers and started going to a medium-sized church, which was fine. I learned a lot there. And then, we kept kind of going to a couple different churches, and they were all these they kept getting larger and larger. And I didn't mind it. I was really involved. There are a lot of ways to get super into the worship team or youth group or whatever. And I was all bought in, the late 90s, early 2000s, youth group kid. That was my favorite. You could just get involved in all of the things. And went to college, and my sister and I, she's 2 years younger than me, started going to this tiny little church in, I think it was in Marion, Indiana. It's super small. And it was the smallest church I'd ever been part of, and I loved it. But college is such a weird time because you don't, at least where I was, you don't really find community at the church that you go to. At least I didn't. And so it was just a new expression of church that I was oh, this is interesting. Well, I graduated and I kept going to bigger and bigger churches, eventually moved out to Colorado for seminary and started working for a medium-sized church that functioned as a megachurch, or wanted to function as a megachurch. So super high production value, a lot of programs, a lot of ministries, and just tons of people. I think at one point we had 4 different services between Saturday and Sunday. And so just tons of people cycled in and out. And I was going to seminary while I was at that church, and kind of like Nathan, just realized I'm wasting away. And there was a level to that specific church that just bulldozed me. They saw that I had some high potential for different skills that I had. I was really eager to do the work. I had moved here and had no friends, had no community, and I was oh, the church, this is where I'll get really involved. And was just taken advantage of, which I feel is the story of a lot of people who wind up in small churches, which I'm sure we'll get into a little bit later. But I left that church right around the time, pretty much right after COVID started. I'd finished seminary and just needed a break, needed to get out. And it is a super long story, but found the Sacred Grace through a friend of mine who was on staff, not Nathan, and realized that it was a stark difference than where I'd been before and what I had seen before, in a really light and refreshing way, in a way that did not demand anything from me, but invited me to be part of it. And a lot of the bigger churches I've been part of, it was you have to be part of this, you have to volunteer, you have to give X amount of hours and time, and just, they just beat you up. It's you're in a boxing ring and you can't get out. So it has been, I've only been on staff since January, so it's only been a couple of months, but already in that time, being part of a small church is so refreshing and life-giving. And I keep coming back to this idea of being seen and known. Like in churches, we want to be seen and known. And in the large churches that I've been part of, at least, you can walk in, go on an upper balcony, and just like sit in the shadows and leave right before it's fully over, and no one sees you and no one knows you. And I think for a time, we really like that. I think part of us wants that a little bit. But in small churches, you can't really do that very well.
I feel like small churches kind of demand like relational currency from you, because you have like people are going to ask you questions. They might be awkward or weird. You might not know how to answer them, or you might have the same conversation like 2,000 times with the same people, but at least you're like, that's demanded of you. And actually I think that's a lot richer kind of expression. For me, I am not a pastor, but my experience in church, I've worked in churches before, usually doing music things. So worship directing, things like that. I grew up in a probably 600 to 800 member Presbyterian church in Austin, Texas. And in high school, we thought it was really cool. There was this big church that's still in existence in Austin that had like amazing music, and it was huge. And there were like 4 services of, 2,000 people. And we just thought it was really cool to say that we were a part of that church. And so I started to kind of more subconsciously than anything else, but place that expectation on other churches. Well, if you're not the best at these things, then it's probably not worth doing it. But I ended up going to college my freshman year at a school in Texas, left there, took a semester off, and then ended up going to Wyoming, which has like less total people than probably the church that I was going to in Austin.
Right.
And so I was kind of thrust into small churches that way, and actually fell in love with the close nature of it, the proximity to people. You have to kind of get to know everyone's mess, and that's like a really good thing, but it's also sometimes really hard. We're going to talk about that more later. I was working in coffee back in 2016. This is how I got involved with the Sacred Grace. And Nathan was looking for someone to lead worship, and he called my brother.
Anybody who has any sort of musical talent
Do
whatsoever.
you own a guitar? You're in.
Kazoo?
That was
Recorder? Fantastic.
That was
A xylophone.
the criteria. Absolutely. That was absolutely the criteria. And Nathan called my brother, who was a worship director here in Littleton, Colorado, actually, and said, "Do you know anyone?" He said, "Call my brother." I met with Nathan. Before Nathan even said anything, I was like, "I don't want to do this."
No, thank you.
I'm out of here.
And Nathan was like, just hear me out.
I have so much to offer you. So much money.
But he was also like,
And friendship.
but also you were like, I mean, I haven't offered you a job yet.
True.
And I was like, fair enough. But Nathan proceeded to tell me, about how this church would kind of be intentionally small, celebrate smallness, celebrate proximity to the neighborhood, integration. And I had never heard anyone speak like that, because it was always either spoken or unspoken, kind of a pressure cooker of like, how do we get more people all the time? Now, you might be, if you're watching this, thinking, I definitely need another podcast in my life.
Who doesn't?
Probably thinking, I definitely don't need another podcast in my life.
Who asked for this?
And you're probably right. Nobody asked for this except us. And we think, though, that it's going to be really valuable to provide this resource for small churches. I want to talk about some statistics first, because I think there are a lot of misconceptions. Every time I've told someone about what we're doing and I've heard these basic statistics, it's usually been like a kind of a shock. So 2/3 of churches in America are less than 100 people. 85% of churches in America are less than 200, and 95% of churches are less than 500 people in America.
Wow.
So the vast majority of churches in America, in the world, are small expressions of church.
Yeah.
People choose those. They're in small communities, or like us, they're in, kind of a smaller city in the context of a larger metro area. But we have people come in all the time that are like, I actually was looking for something small. And as we talk about kind of the future of the church, we'll get into that. We also want to establish, like, we're not here to bash big churches. We all have our different experiences.
We all come
with
from
them.
big churches, and we're actually really grateful for like the impact they made on us, I think, and hopefully that'll become really clear over time that, like, we'd love to celebrate what big church is doing in a lot of people's lives and did in our lives. And also it wasn't for us, and it's maybe also not for you if you're listening to this. Like, you might be looking for something that's a little smaller.
Yeah, totally. I mean, the thing we saw is, like, all the resources, even for almost all of them, even for small church people, were given, produced, written by big mega church pastors, or large selling authors
who had maybe actually never been part of small churches. A lot of the content I've seen is by people who grew up and were taught within these larger expressions of church.
Totally.
And so when they're talking about how they approach a particular problem or a particular, even celebrating something in their particular context, they don't really have the experience in a smaller church context to speak to that. And so I think that a lot of times I'll hear somebody who has worked for or been a part of a large church or like you said, like published and has a huge audience, that kind of thing. And the way that they kind of see the world is just different than the way that I see it, because they have resources at their fingertips that I don't. And so the sort of scrappy, resourceful nature of the small church is a fascinating topic to me, and obviously a motivating one too. It's obviously something we care a lot about.
Right. And we're not, like, just here for pastors.
Right.
Members, volunteers, other leaders in the church, in the small church. That's who we kind of want to focus on. I'm not a pastor.
Yeah,
and
people
I'm
like
super
you.
interested.
Yeah.
I stepped down from after I actually took the job as worship director. I stepped down about 2.5 years later to pursue a career in film, which is why we have way too many cameras in here.
That's why we look so legit.
There are so many, and there are probably going to be, tens and tens of people who listen to this.
Yes, perhaps dozens.
But we are small church minded and don't really use metrics all that often.
We could have a small podcast audience, just
for
like we have a small
Let's
church
not even count the number.
That'd be great. Yeah, because who even cares, right?
Who even cares?
Exactly. We're also not the only ones doing this. Carl Vaders has some really good books about this. He also has a podcast called Can This Work in a Small Church, where he talks about a bunch of different topics. Really good podcast. The 95 podcast also talks about all the churches under 500 people and how they're important in the world. So we're not the only ones, but we think there are some unique things that some people aren't really talking about.
Yeah.
We're excited. Yeah, so let's start with, like, why do pastors and small church leaders feel such a pressure to show rapid growth in metrics, or even just, consistent growth? Like, why is that such a thing that we kind of think we have to have in our churches?
I think in part it's because it's the only mechanism we've ever been given for measurement. So if all you've ever known is a tape measure, and that's all you have ever used to measure anything, and then somebody asks you to measure the weight of something or like the mass of something, your tape measure is not going to really work. It's not going to do you any good. You need a scale, right? So, and really what you need in order to measure things in general, whether you're in a woodworking shop or you're like in metal shop or you're a mechanic or whatever, you need dozens and dozens of tools that can measure different things in different ways. And I think that the only mechanism we've really been given is how many people are showing up on a Sunday. It's not even, the question isn't even how many people are a part of your church. The question is how many people are showing up on a Sunday on a regular basis. And that metric is just just broken. Like, it just doesn't work. It's not useful. Not just in our context. I think it doesn't work really at all in terms of actually identifying and measuring the health of your church, or whether or not your church is successful based on the mission that you've set out and been called to. And it doesn't work in a place like Colorado, where at best people show up to church twice a month. Like, it's just baked into the culture here.
Right. There's so much else to do.
There's so much else to do on a weekend. And so it's really hard for people to, and then I think elsewhere where there's not maybe so much else to do, people are just tend to be very busy, and people have a hard time prioritizing something like a, worship experience of some kind. So if literally the people who are showing up at your weekly gathering is the metric for success, then it's pretty hard to say that anybody's really being very successful, right? So I think the mechanism's broken, honestly, or we just needed a bunch of new ones, honestly.
Yeah. I'm trying to think back to when I first realized people counted numbers in church, and why that would have become such a like priority to so many people. And I think tent revivals, they would like count the amount of people who would walk in and count the amount of people who went up to the front or raised their hands or had some sort of spiritual experience. And so you start gathering all this information, gathering all these numbers. And then as the church has changed over decades since those tent revivals, we just keep thinking, well, how, if the expression of churches looks different than it did before, then how do we measure what this looks like? I've gone to a bunch of conferences, read a bunch of books because of the old larger churches that I would work for, that were told this is what success looks like. And so if your leadership is reading these books, looking at these resources, listening to these podcasts that are like, yeah, this is how you grow your numbers, this is how you can talk to other churches about what's happening in your building. If that's what you're ingesting and listening, then yeah, you're going to think my number matters. Like this is really important. I was part of a church a few years ago that was like, it was gathering so many metrics. We had a hard time figuring out how to track them. And we had this massive sheet that did all these calculations. And we padded the numbers. Like the lead pastor wanted X number of people in X number of spots. So we counted the number of chairs in the building. We counted the number of butts and seats. We counted the number of volunteer positions open, volunteer positions filled. We counted the number of new people that we handed something to. We counted the number of, all of these different metrics and numbers, and gathered all of this data. And it was like a pride point then when this pastor would go to conferences. He'd have it at his fingertips all the time to be like, these are our numbers, and these
and
are.
it was all quantitative.
Yes, every single one
of them.
It was
all like, how much or how many of this one thing do we have?
Yeah, well, and I remember pushing back one time. I don't push back very often, but I would get these. I would get these like anger bursts in staff meetings, and think. Because I was the one honestly tracking a lot of these numbers, and I hate number tracking. I'm not very good at it. I'd get things wrong all the time, like do a formula wrong, and then I get in trouble. And I'd be like, well, what does it matter? Like, shouldn't it matter that people are showing up? Like, do we need to know all these numbers? And I think the thing that, at least this church, and I'm sure they heard it from somewhere and they heard it from somewhere, so it's not them alone in a vacuum. Well, numbers represent people. And so we should care about the numbers because the numbers represent people. And I always had a really hard time with that. Like, I don't think numbers represent people all that much, because you're not learning who they are. You're not learning their stories. You're not really in their lives.
Right?
Yeah,
it's just like
totally.
You count as one and you count as one. Well, you two are very different people. You have different needs. You have different personality traits. You have different backgrounds and stories, different future trajectories. Like, you're two very different people. So the idea that I would count you both sort of equally, quote unquote, doesn't really help me care for you as a pastor, right? And I think one of the things that's helpful in the conversation for me, at least, has been to figure out how to keep the pendulum from swinging all the way to the other side, because
numbers don't matter at all.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Right. Because the temptation is to go like, well, they don't matter at all, and so let's just quit counting anything. Well, we count how many people show up on a Sunday. We count how much money comes in per month. We count, How many volunteer positions we have open, that kind of thing, how many staff positions we have open, that kind of thing. That sort of thing is important to know, so that you can track, that version of progress, because it's not nothing, but it's also not everything. And so there's so much else that I want to learn how to track and measure and understand, that's more qualitative, to understand, how are our people growing spiritually? How are they growing relationally? How are they growing missionally in their community? All these things. Those are the things I really want to know, because I think that they're actually much better indicators of health than simply, did that person show up or not?
Right.
Absolutely. Actually heard on Carl Vader's podcast something really interesting, like the whole idea of rapid growth, counting numbers, and success, meaning, increasing numbers all the time.
Mm-hmm.
We call that the church growth movement. And, I think a lot of people think that was 70s and 80s, the commercialization, and the 90s, the marketing strategies of church.
Kind of the birth of evangelicalism in the U.S., right? It's kind of when that sort of...
But he actually talked about Donald McGavran, who, when you trace the church growth movement all the way back, this guy was a missionary in India in like the 20s. And his, he started kind of you could say a movement. We like to say that, but a system of small churches in India. He never pastored a church of more than 100 people.
Huh.
And he came back to America to kind of try to expand this. And his idea of success was like, are you making disciples? Are there like new believers? He was vocally worried that it would turn into this mass marketing thing. And he kind of looked at the way that Americans, specifically white Americans, thought of like the frontier kind of mentality of the history of our country, where if it's there, let's take it.
Just sort of colonizing everything that we can see.
Yeah,
right?
Let's do big things.
Yeah.
Let's start a movement. We were kind of the ones to say, like, let's start this movement. Let's do something big. And it has turned into like, let's use corporate kind of strategies to like increase the number of people in our church. And so, there are pluses and minuses to that, but I just thought it was so interesting. The guy was worried it would turn into counting numbers of just people who are already Christians going to like the newest, hippest thing.
Just moving around,
Right.
And he was like, yeah, that's not what this is about.
Yeah.
But
wow.
It turned into that, of course.
Yeah, absolutely.
So throughout this podcast, we're going to have a bunch of different guests, experts in a variety of different topics. We're going to redefine success, because a lot of people think that's, growing in numbers, but also talk about the hardships of being small. The fact that you don't have a lot of people means you have so many less volunteers and so many less, people to kind of support the needs and wants of a community. We're going to talk about engaging politics in a healthy way. We're going to talk about justice issues in the context of the small church, why that's important to engage in, and how, as we're looking at like huge, weighty justice kind of issues, how a small church with limited resources, no budget, and a bunch of volunteers can actually engage in seeking justice where we live. We're going to talk about house churches. We're also going to talk about expressions of church that live hyper locally, which is what our church does. But it's not just for those. There are lots of small churches that don't kind of have a parish model. But we're also going to talk about the history of the church and the fact that for almost the entire history of the church, it was kind of small, very slow, and like pretty boring up until the last 30 years.
And still in other parts of the world, the church is underground. It's very small. It's a network of, what we in the U.S. would call small groups, essentially. And we tend to become so centered on kind of whatever we're doing, and it becomes myopic, and we forget that what our experience isn't what everybody else's experience is. And so, yeah, I'm really excited to keep talking about it. But I'm excited to learn a lot, because the people that we're having on this podcast are people that I'm just really looking forward to learning from. I don't have a lot of answers that I'm hoping to gain from a lot of the people that are going to be on this, so I'm excited for that.
Nathan has very high hopes.
Yeah, exactly.
For the learning experience.
We started this, so
I guess the pressure's on me.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
I better ask some good questions.
Yeah.
Where does the small church find itself in 2022? Not even just the church in America. We're not completely out of the woods of COVID, but we're definitely trying to have some sense of normalcy and contact and getting back together. Nathan, I know that you've heard from some big church employees and pastors, and that the kind of live streaming that we were forced to do for so long has had like a big effect on big churches. And then can you talk about that a little bit? And both of you talk about how that looks in a small church coming out of COVID.
Yeah. Yeah, COVID had an impact on the whole world, and it changed the way we do a lot of things. And for large churches, most of them had some kind of live stream or after the fact video production of what they were doing on a typical weekend that was available online. There were plenty of churches, even here in the Denver area, that have like what they call an online church, or like a completely web-based community who never show up to a brick and mortar experience. They've literally never been, and they've got pastors who are specific to those people. And they have a whole video production that takes place for that group of people that has nothing to do with the people who show up, the next day for the face-to-face thing. And so in some ways, they're all ready for the pandemic. They were all prepared because they had all the equipment, they had all the expertise, they had all the know-how. What seemed to have shifted for a lot of them was when they weren't allowing as many or any people into the building for an in-person worship gathering. Those folks who were watching from home realized this is tremendously convenient. Like the idea that I can live stream this thing, or the idea that I can watch it after the fact or whatever, this is great. I may never leave my house again, and I think a lot of people who are like working from home now are feeling that way too. They're like, well, this is awesome. I'll just like basically hole up in here and never leave, get my groceries delivered, get my church delivered, get my, whatever, everything's delivered. And so I've talked to several large church pastors who have said, yeah, like our in-person numbers, if you will, have dropped dramatically, but our online numbers have increased dramatically, sort of with the same, kind of at the exact same rate, but equal and opposite. And so it makes me wonder, what is the effect on a person? What's the impact on a person who was having an in-person worship gathering, at least with some sort of regularity, who now has a virtual web-based worship experience as their kind of primary means for experiencing relationship and worship, et cetera. And I think it's too soon to tell. But I'm very curious. I'm very curious to hear even on an education front, like how does this affect our kids in school who went virtual for so long and now they're back in person? I don't think we're going to have that kind of data for a while, but it'll be really interesting to see. For a small church like ours is a good example. We were confronted with this kind of philosophical problem because we had to send everyone home and we couldn't have people in our building or with any sort of like proximity to each other. And we were sort of forced into the digital world, and we had resisted it for a long time. Like we've always had like a sermon podcast, which even that kind of bugged me because I was like, no, I want people to be here. Like, I want people to be a part of this thing. I mean,
so we did another podcast.
Yeah, exactly. We famously don't have any, maybe infamously don't have any like doctrinal or theological statements on our website. And my philosophy behind that all along has been come and see, come and be a part. I think theology plays out in community. So you'll come and find what we believe by being a part of this thing, and I think that there's probably a shelf life to that philosophy. I think we're going to be having to like post some things at some point. But I've always wanted people to just come and be a part of this thing. And then all of a sudden it's like, well, now you can't. Like, you're not allowed to come be a part of this thing. Now you have to be a part of this thing in a virtual world. So we did like the Zoom church thing, and we made it really hard on ourselves because we really, really wanted it to be as relational as possible. So we had like people watching this video of the service that Canaan made, but they were watching it together in these Zoom rooms, and like it was super complicated, but it was like it kind of worked for our vibe. And then after that, we started live streaming, and now we live stream our service, even though people can be back in the same room. And if it wasn't extremely easy at this point to plug in a camera and live stream on YouTube, we frankly wouldn't be doing it. but it's just so easy. There's kind of no reason not to. And there are a handful of people who join us every week online for various reasons. A lot of them are health reasons, and some of them are proximity reasons. They're out of town or they moved away and they'd like to still be a part. So we've had to just kind of navigate this like philosophical shift of, we really care about the in-person gathered experience and expression, especially as a small church. We find that to be really significant. And also we had to like do something digital. And that was hard and not easy by any means. I mean, you could probably speak more to like kind of what we're doing now and how it compares to what like a larger church. I mean, you recently sort of came from a larger church.
Yeah. Well, when I left my previous church, it was the beginning. Well, it was like May of 2020. So all of the initial craziness of how do we do church online was slowing down just a smidge. And we had done all those things like, well, I guess we're virtual pastors now, you know? So we had the chat rooms open. It all just felt, I mean, it was what we needed to do at the time. It's what the options were. I think I might always be surprised at churches that choose to do that for the long haul. I think it might be, I don't know what the future of the church looks like. I can't project the next 50 years of what things are going to look like. But being not in this word of proximity just keeps flashing, right? If we're not actually in proximity with one another, and we keep having these really convenient online church experiences, we miss out, in my opinion, on God's purpose for the church. You know, you look in scripture and you see these people living in communities together. You see them doing meals together, meeting each other's needs, and granted, totally different time, totally different context, completely different. But I just keep thinking like there's got to be, not like drawing a line at some point, but we're going to get to a point where things loosen even more than they are now, and people are just choosing not to go to church because they really like the convenience, or they have enjoyed the sermons that they get or the music that they get from a church that's in a different country, in a different state, in a different region. And so they can't go to the church that they want to go to. I think that was also why we saw so many fluctuations in numbers over like at the beginning of COVID, because all these churches now had live streams or options to watch online, and you could choose anywhere you wanted.
Yeah.
Like I watched a church in Chicago for a while. Once I left that other church, I watched a bunch of random things from all over the country.
Your motivation to be a part of a church was based on what you wanted or felt like you needed. It had nothing to do with like where that church actually was. Like location just became obsolete, essentially.
Right. And everything we're trying to do at the Sacred Grace is like, hey, we want location to be really important.
We'd like for that to be
right?
the first question you ask. How close is this to me?
See you in coffee shops. I want to bump into you in the street. Like there's not a day that goes by unless I'm out of town that I see somebody who's part of our church walking through somewhere. This woman walked through a coffee shop I was in a couple weeks ago, and my face like lit up. I was so excited to see her, and she was like, why are you responding this way to me? And I said, I love seeing people. Like I love seeing the people from our church in different spaces, and you don't get to do that if you're fully virtual church. You don't get to really do that. You don't get to do it to the same extent if you're in a really big mega church.
It's really hard to bump into people.
It is really hard. Or you bump into people and you have no idea they even go to your church.
Oh,
you know?
Right.
Like you could be in a coffee shop full of people that go to the same church as you, and you have no idea because there are thousands of people that go, how would you know? And I think what a lot of people are yearning for, at least the people, like the new people that walk through our doors and I either have coffee with, or we just kind of like get into a light conversation, they're like looking for places where they can be known. And you don't get that online. Like not really. You can chat with a pastor in a chat room, whatever, on these live services. But, you know, people are yearning for places where somebody knows their name. And if that's not the church you're in, maybe you don't want that to be the church you're in. But what we're finding is that when people show up at the Sacred Grace, they want somebody to know their name. They like want to be in a safe place where like we're not asking anything from them. We were just talking about yesterday, someone who is like, I think I might want to volunteer, but I've been really hurt. Like I've been really used.
I'm really worried about how you guys are going to handle this.
Right.
Which is totally fair.
Right. And one, that makes me so sad, but also I get it because that happened to me.
Yeah.
Like that is so similar to my story, and it's hard to come back. It's hard to even walk through the doors of a church again if that's been your story.
Absolutely.
And so anybody who shows up, I'm like, I want to take care of you so carefully. Like I just want you to show up and not feel like you need, like we don't.
There's no prerequisite.
Right.
You get to be here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that is something so unique about small churches is you get to, like, we know the new people who show up because we don't know them.
Yeah. It's really obvious on a Sunday. If I'm standing up there,
totally
even
is.
I'm preaching, I'm like filing away, like back left corner. There's a couple there. I've never seen them before. And I'm going to go find them.
There are no more than 100 people at any given
No,
service.
I think on Easter we had 100 people.
Yeah,
there you
100
go.
is very high. We have
100
like
would be like
50 to 65.
I'd be a little worried, like, what? Do we have enough communion supplies? You know, like
I would be sweating.
Yeah, I'd be like, oh, what do we do with all these people?
Right.
Yeah.
That is where numbers come in
to
handy.
give people some context, we're like, I don't know, between 50 and 75 on a typical Sunday is pretty common for us.
I mean, as a parishioner of your church, seeing people at the grocery store, at a coffee shop, or just walking down the street, like there's nothing in terms of like relationship like a person lighting up when they see you. I think maybe a lot of people have forgotten what that feels like, or sadly have never felt or never experienced that before. I also think like we've spent so long staring at people on screens that like there's something like spiritually different to stare at someone in the eyes, like in the physical world. I don't know. It's different.
It's way scarier.
It's scarier. Yeah. It's riskier. It like requires.
But the payoff's really high. I feel.
Yeah.
Right. Like because the connection's much deeper, and it's just
it's not worth it.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Don't do it. Stay inside.
And the podcast is over.
Yeah. Exactly.
Like that's what we've learned today.
One thing I just want to note really quick, I know we got to move on to something else, but I do want to note the fact that there are absolutely people who have been served really well by this shift in churches and this kind of towards the digital, towards the virtual. There are lots of people due to various conditions they have or challenges, phobias, whatever it is that they have that have not allowed them to ever be a part of a physical church, and they've just simply been like disconnected. Right. So in some ways, and one of the reasons why we've kept our live stream, I'm extremely grateful for this pivot, because I think that now there are people who feel like they get to be a part of a smaller, more localized expression of church who cannot leave their home for some reason or another. So I want to recognize that, like, we're talking about like maybe the general population. The recommendation we're making is like find a way to like make eye contact with a physical person in the day. That's a good thing for you. And then there are some people who are simply prohibited from doing that for whatever reasons. And I think that's, that this shift towards virtual and digital has served that population really, really well. So in that regard, I'm grateful for it.
Which is why we still provide it.
Exactly.
But it's not sexy. I mean, like we don't have the resources.
Our live stream is not flashy.
The camera is just a wide shot of the room, and you can barely see who's up there.
Yeah, like the faces are overexposed and blown out, and
exactly, because we don't really know how the lights work, and
right,
precisely. Yeah, you're not tuning into the big experience that's all about those who are staying at home, and there are some people who have to stay at home who would prefer the more scaled back version, and I'm grateful that we get to supply that for like literally 3 people. Like there are literally 3 people who watch our live stream, and I'm just grateful that we get to give that to them,
Right. So talking about like the moment of 2022, pastoring, engaging in formation, discipling, whatever word you want to use for it. What is that like? What are our small church leaders kind of dealing with the needs of people right now, like the spiritual needs?
I sit down with a lot of new people who come through our doors and like fill out a form or whatever, however they get in contact with us. And am getting asked very pointed questions about specific issues, which I love. I have not encountered that before. And granted, I have not been a pastor for decades. I don't have all this experience behind me, but because of what has been going on in the world, because of the changes that have been going on in the church, because of all of the podcasts and shows that have exposed corruption within churches over the last couple of years, especially, people know the things that they're looking for. They know what they're worried about too. And they don't hold back. They just come out. I sat with a woman a couple weeks ago who asked me very pointed questions about what our church believed about sexuality, if people were allowed to do X, Y, and Z based on their sexuality, all of this stuff. And I loved it because I got to say exactly what we think, which we think different things, but we also open our doors and are we love you. Just show up. If you show up, you will see that we love you and we want you to be part of this, no matter what that looks like.
And the person you sit next to probably doesn't see eye to eye with you.
Mm-hmm.
And that's okay because agreement isn't a prerequisite for worship and community and those things.
Right.
So I think that there are a lot of people asking those questions because, and I think this is a good thing, I think we know the red flags that we're looking for now. We know the indicators for corruption, or we know the indicators for abuse. We know the indicators for, an unhealthy, hierarchical staff structure or volunteer expectation or whatever it is. We know what those look like now because of some of these podcasts or because of some of these documentaries or whatever.
Right. And because of the own work that we've been doing.
Yeah, people have done a lot of internal work, right?
A lot of the people that we sit down with have this deep hurt and pain that has come specifically from the church, specifically from the way pastors and leaders have deeply cut them. And it's just devastating. It's absolutely devastating the ways that people who are in positions like us have either abused that, or whether it's intentional or unintentional, it doesn't matter.
And I think one of the things that small church tends to do for that scenario for a person is it sort of puts the person in leadership's entire life kind of out there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't mean to say that I feel like I live in a fishbowl or anything and everybody's always watching, but everyone in our church knows where I live.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone in our church at some point or another, drives by or walks by or runs by or rides their bike by my house at some point, and they see the good, bad, and ugly of our lives. Made it really clear to my wife and my kids when we planted the church, I have zero expectation for perfection for all of you. So if you can even make it to church on a Sunday, just show up as you are. And Julie tells this story. It's one of my favorites. Where when we met at 5:00 in the evening on Sundays, we live across the street from where we used to meet, and so we'd walk. The kids would walk to church with Julie every Sunday evening, and she walked in with the kids, and I can't remember who, but somebody in the group was bleeding, and everyone else in the group was crying, including Julie. And she may have been the one bleeding. I can't remember, but they walk in with blood, sweat, and tears after the 100-yard walk or whatever it is from my front door to the actual
not a long
church
walk.
building.
No, it's
not
100
a long
feet.
walk. Yeah, exactly. But it just exploded somehow on that short distance. And if you're listening to this and you have small kids, you know exactly what that's like. And she walked in and the profanity coming out of her mouth and it was just
so good.
And everyone's looking at her, and then people were looking at me are you going to do something about this? And I was just nope. This is it. This is our family. And you're seeing the good, bad, and ugly. And I think that that's one of the things that small church lends itself to, because you're going to run into me on my worst day. And hopefully you also run into me on my best day, but you're going to run into me on my worst day, and my kids on their worst day, and my wife on her worst day. And I think that hopefully that is a salve to some of the wounds for people who feel as though these insulated isolated pastors have been given essentially zero accountability and oversight. And that's not to say that that's all megachurch pastors or anything like that. It's just, I think that is a benefit and an asset to the small church community.
Right.
Yeah,
There's no
more
bubble around us.
Yeah, right.
There's accountability because, like you said, everyone sees your good, bad, and
Yeah.
ugly.
Right.
They know where we grocery
like-
shop. They know where we eat
Yeah.
out.
Totally.
Because
Yeah.
they're right there next to us,
Yeah.
honestly.
And they're doing it with
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
they're actually with you.
Right.
we all
Either
live
that
in
or they're across the restaurant.
we all live in a city where there's a pretty high population density, and so like my physical literal neighbors, I mean, like I can reach out my bedroom window and I can touch their fence, like I can put my hand into their property. Like that's how close we are in proximity to each other. You're surrounded by people in an apartment. You're surrounded by people in an apartment.
Mhm.
And so like if you raise your voice and like holler at somebody in your household, your neighbors are going to hear it, like everyone's seeing and feeling each other. And that's really intimidating. And in another way, it's also feels like the most honest way I've ever lived, rather than just having all this space and like no one knows anything about me,
At our church, we've got a lot of people, going through a lot of different things, believing, a lot of different things
Mhm.
because of history with church or being pushed out because of certain things. But like, I feel like a lot of the response from people might be tempted to just preach from the stage about those things, but like formation, and try to kind of form people in the way of Jesus about those things. But like formation definitely doesn't happen in isolation.
Yeah.
It happens in like messy proximity, looking someone in the eye. And
Yeah, I'd much rather folks engage and navigate a deconstruction of their faith or big questions about sexuality or gender or who should be in leadership and who shouldn't, that kind of thing. I'd much rather them engage those in a dialogue, in a community, even if the conclusion is like, we don't see eye to eye on that and we don't exactly know how that's going to play out. I'd so much rather that than them hear me sort of preach at them about that. And then they all walk away kind of going like, well, I either agree with that or I don't. And if I don't, I better get packing and find another place to go. So it doesn't say we don't talk about those things, from the front per se, but I would much rather those conversations be a dialogue among, many people. That'd be preferable.
Mm-hmm.
yeah, exactly. Like having to look at someone when you're talking about really vulnerable things
Yeah.
makes you, I think, inherently more connected to that person than, it's a lot easier to say something without specifically looking at them and watch them walk away
Yeah.
than the opposite. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. And that's something we can do in small churches because you can actually know the names of everybody and do that.
It
go to
lends
your church.
itself.
Right.
Yeah, it lends itself to that.
Right. Well, and the beauty too is when we sit down to meet with new people, a lot of times they're surprised that it's us doing it. They're like, "Oh, you're one of the pastors and you're meeting with me." Like, yeah. I want, like, what else would I be doing?
Yeah.
What else should I? Yeah, that's what I'm gonna like choose to spend my time doing.
That's my job.
Right. Yeah. But in all of these other larger churches, there are people underneath lead pastors or other pastors who get to do those things, whether it's because they really want to or because the other pastors like have such a low priority of meeting new people, which is what it is. But we get to like meet the people that walk through the doors and get to know them, and they get to ask the people that they see up front. And we have all kinds of people up front on a Sunday. It's never just us. Like
It's maybe half staff.
yeah.
The other half's volunteers.
But they get to like see and know us from the start. There's like no, like I said a little bit ago, there's no bubble around us that they have to tiptoe around. They get it. Like we'll meet with them we meet people at bars, we meet people at restaurants, we meet them at coffee shops, and
In their own home.
Yeah, in their own home. And so many times it's disarming because they're like, "Oh, you like actually are choosing to spend some time with me." Yeah, we want to. Like we're going to get into the mess. If you want us to, we're going to get into the mess because we love you already, and more importantly, God loves you already. And this is like the joy and delight of a small church. Like we get to step into that from the start.
Pre-COVID, I made it a goal to try to visit as many people's workplaces as I possibly could. So like visit them at their place of work. Cause like I work, kind of similar hours to a regular person. And so they would be at work and I'd be at work, and it'd be really hard to get together with them. And so I'd be like, hey, I'm going to bring you lunch. It's on me, and I'm going to bring it to your place of work. We'll have lunch together. You can show me around, introduce me to some coworkers. And it was like one of my favorite traditions. And when COVID happened, I was like, I can't really do that anymore because nobody's going to work. And I really wasn't supposed to go to people's houses. And so the way that I got into people's lives
You
doing
weren't
that,
supposed to, but
I
you
did anyways.
sometimes.
Yeah,
So
sometimes I did anyways. We did because we still wanted to do communion together. We wanted it to be a physical experience, and so we did communion delivery by bike, and so people could sign up for communion delivery. I'd load all my kids onto my cargo bike, and on the front I had like little bottles of wine, like a loaf of
Can I
bread,
tell a
whatever.
story? Can I tell a story
Yeah,
about
do
that?
it.
So we signed up for the communion delivery service. We live 2
Load
blocks
all your
away
kids up on the bike.
from their family.
Mhm.
They have the weirdest bike I've ever seen. The kids call it the hoopty
Yeah.
for some reason.
Yeah, there's no telling why.
And they, at least at the time, 3 of them could fit on the back behind you.
Yeah, we
And-
still can do
like
that.
a
We still
literal
fit 3
cart.
on there. Yeah.
Yeah. And I remember clear as day. My wife and I live on the 3rd floor of an apartment building, and we start, we're sitting there working or doing whatever we were doing in the middle of the afternoon, and we just hear these faint voices just shouting, Canaan, Canaan, Erica, Canaan. And we are like, what is that? We open the door to our balcony, and we see down in this big parking lot below us just the bike. So they didn't even stop. They were like, we're just going to keep
We're just
on
doing
going.
loops, screaming at you guys.
Screaming, saying, we have your communion stuff. And it's just like, I wouldn't trade that for the world.
Yeah.
I think that's so awesome.
It was just one of the ways we were able to like maintain like that physical eye contact with people, and like some people were like, please don't come up to my door or come talk to me. I would leave it at the door. I'd knock, and then I'd like, run back to our bike or whatever. But it was like, we were just looking for those connections. And now post-COVID, we're kind of rethinking like, well, how do we do that again? How do we find a way to get into people's lives rather than always being like, come to my office and set up a meeting and, it'd be very formal and whatever. Just come have a meal at my house, or can I have a meal at yours, that kind of thing.
Right. Last topic, because we've been going for a while now. I'm going to quote you, Nathan.
This will be good.
Something you used to say a lot. I haven't heard you say in a while.
Oh, I'm
so
sorry.
maybe you're getting worse.
Or maybe it's
as
good
a
that I haven't.
teacher or a pastor or whatever.
Was it a bad quote? Because maybe that's why I stopped saying it.
It was a good quote. You used to always say, and I think you still believe this, like one of the most sacred things you can do is leave this building on a Sunday.
Yeah.
For both of you, how are small churches like really uniquely positioned to actually integrate in their cities? I know there are a billion ways we can, and a lot of ways we haven't yet. But how are we uniquely positioned in a way that like a big church just can't do?
The reason why I have said that, and I actually would like to start saying that again. I'd kind of forgot about that one. The reason why I would say that,
that's
yeah, I'm gonna say it this Sunday.
I have direct access to the pastor. I can hold him accountable to
his
This
closing.
is small church in real time.
You're seeing it happen. You're watching it. You're welcome, everybody.
I can also hold you accountable on other things
To the
too,
stuff
if you
that I say
want.
that are
Right.
really stupid. Yeah,
This
exactly.
podcast is going
There
to
are
turn
plenty of those
dark
too.
here soon.
Yeah, exactly. This is just gonna be like a confession booth. I would say that because I think that the general perception and my perception from my own experience and many other people as well is when I go to church, like this is a very sacred thing. This is a sacred rhythm, and worshiping with other people is really, really important and honorable. And I agree with that. And I think that being sent out, being commissioned to go do something in your community is also sacred, also beautiful, also honorable. So I would try to emphasize that. I think it's unique in a small church, especially a church as locally connected as we are, because I was sending my neighbors home to be my neighbors. Like I wasn't, when I think in other church expressions I've been a part of, when people would leave, they would get in their car. I mean, massive parking lots, right? Like the thing I try to remind people of is the walk from my parking spot to my office at my last church was significantly farther than my walk from my home to my office at the church we planted. And if I forgot something in my office at one end of the building and needed to get to the other end of the building, it was a 1/4 mile walk because the building was that massive. But all that was to say that people live and kind of come commute from all over the place, and they come back. And so when you're sending people out, there's just like this massive diaspora to like God knows where. And there's something different about being sent out to like go be a neighbor in the neighborhood that you're already meeting in. And I think that was just a unique perspective, and still is, that we get to tell our people like, whatever, because a lot of people in our church ride their bike to church or walk to church, that kind of thing. So like wherever you're going and however you're getting there, you're still in this sacred zone. You're still in like our parish. You're still in this place that we've all chosen to take spiritual and social responsibility for. And so as you go, you're being commissioned every single week, not just like that one time you decide to change jobs, we're commissioning you for that one thing, but like every week you're being commissioned to go and to be integrated within, and then also to serve sacrificially your neighbor. That's why we used to say that, and probably will start again.
Mm-hmm. Well, when you don't go to church in your neighborhood, which many people do not,
even people in our church,
you get in your car, you drive far away, and people don't know what church you go to. They don't know that you just came from church. They don't know any of that. When we leave church, we probably go out to lunch with someone else from church. We talk to business owners who know we're part of a church.
There's
like
those Sacred Grace people again.
Yeah. Like they know
us.
They know that we're going to come hang out. And it's that proximity thing again. It's a different mindset from we leave church on a Sunday and don't think about it again. Right? Like I think a lot of churches that I've been part of in the past, it's this spiritual high on a Sunday, and then you dip down for the rest of the week, and then you come back the next Sunday. And it's just this roller coaster of Sunday is the time I get my fill of XYZ. That is the sacred space I walk into. And then I go and live the rest of my life. Well, we're trying to make it much more of an even line of like, well, no, all of the things that we do are sacred things. And if we only are showing up to church thinking it's the most sacred thing, then we've lost sight of who we are in our communities, who we are in our families, who we are with all of our friends. And I love that we go places and people are like, oh yeah, we know you're a pastor. We know you're a part of this church. And we try our best to have that be a positive and helpful thing. I think something that big churches can do as well is just show up to things too.
Yeah.
Like we try to make it as easy as possible for our people to know when city council meetings are, when we had our old building, we hosted as many city events as we possibly could to be like, hey, we might not see eye to eye and everything, but we want to invite you into our space if you need it. And like Nathan, you're super involved in a lot of things. I'm slowly dipping my toes into what it looks like to be civically minded and active. And we have, people in all different city jobs coming to our church. And
I think in that we've created like this interdependency, which I think we'll get to in another episode coming up, but that where like we need the city and the city needs us. We need our neighbors and our neighbors need us. Right. The sort of Messiah complex that I think a lot of churches end up in, probably not on purpose, but they end up there, where it's like, if it wasn't for us, it's a good thing we're here, because otherwise you wouldn't have, whatever. And I do think the church has something to offer. That's why we started one. I think it's really important. And I also think that the city has a lot to offer us as well. And so we've created this interdependency, but we've done so via like the sort of the avenue has been relationships. So when I show up at a city council meeting, especially if I show up at a city council meeting and I'm confronting a city council person, this is a person I have a relationship with. Right. In theory, right? Like ideally, this is a person I've had coffee with. This is a person who maybe I've been to their house or they've been to mine. This is a person who I'm going to bump into at a coffee shop or a grocery store. So when I show up and confront them on something that I feel like is maybe problematic in either their behavior or the city or whatever, it changes my tone dramatically. It changes their receptiveness to what I have to say dramatically. And so that the relationship has kind of become the avenue by which all of this takes place. And the same goes for my neighbor. If my neighbor is doing something that, I need to talk to them about or whatever, this better not be my first interaction with them. Like that's problematic. If my first interaction with them is like, your 2:00 in the morning parties are actually a problem for my kids, whatever, that should probably be my like 10th interaction with them, when I'm confronting them on something. So anyway, yeah, I think we're getting into some new territory now, but yeah, small church I think is uniquely positioned for a lot of the things that we're talking about right now. And
we'll definitely get there later in the season. Maggie and Nathan, thank you so much.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, signing off. We did it, friends.
Yeah.
Parish Podcast is a production of Vineworks Film Company. The executive producer is Nathan Hoag. This episode was produced, edited, and hosted by Canaan Hurst. Graphic design and set design by Erica Krysl. Find us on social media at Parish Podcast. Remember to subscribe and rate this podcast wherever you listen. This video podcast has been made possible by the generous support of the Sacred Grace, an incubator and accelerator that's cultivating leaders to take spiritual and social responsibility for their neighbors and neighborhoods. For more information, visit thesacredgrace.com.